This is a country that has pointed thousands of nuclear weapons at us for 60 years. And so, call me kooky. I would like that to stop. And if that means that Ukraine is the place where we have to make this fight happen, so be it. Because no matter what happens to Ukraine, there's nothing in Ukraine that is a core American national interest. This is the perfect place to bleed Russians without having any immediate impacts on anything else that we care about. Now, if Ukraine falls, which it will, and if the occupation is finally pacified, which it might, then we have to deal with this for real with NATO states. So drawing a line in Ukraine, I think, is the perfect place, because if it stops here, then it stops forever. And if it doesn't stop here, then we're talking about needing to defend places like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Romania. It's a very different picture from a risk point of view, and I would greatly prefer to not have a showdown with nuclear power in countries that we are treaty bound to defend. Sure, so Putin certainly thought that the war was going to be easier than it has been. All indications suggested that within a month they would have absolutely obliterated any meaningful conventional military capacity, and then it would be an issue of mopping up a country of 45 million people, which would take 2 or 3 months. That's clearly not happening, but the original goal was you secure Ukraine as quickly as possible. You set up your Quisling regime in Kiev. The thinking was there were plenty of Russian speakers. Nearly a third of the population speaks Russian fluently, mostly as their first language, and roughly a quarter of the population are actually ethnic Russians. So they thought they were going to be, to a degree, welcomed, at least in the East, and that they would not have to be going, building to building, leveling everything. Once they secured Ukraine, they would then grab Moldova, probably over a long weekend, because it's a country of 2.5 million people. And they already have some troops there in a secessionist province called Transnistria that they kind of created in the same way they created the Donbass republics. Once that is done, then they go into the 5 NATO countries. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are one of those gateways on the Baltic coast. That's how the Swedes have invaded in the past. Eastern Poland going up to the Vistula River in downtown Warsaw to plug the Polish gap, which is how the Germans have always liked to invade, and then going to the southwest a little bit to grab territory adjacent to Moldovan Ukraine that is in Romania to plug the Bessarabian gap, which has always been the Turkish approach. That's always been the plan. That's always what the Russians have needed for security. But because the Ukrainians have provided more of a resistance and seem to have a stronger national identity than the Russians had counted on, they are now applying tactics that they used first in Grozny and then that they later perfected in Aleppo in the civil war in Syria. And it's simply urban obliteration to destroy every single piece of civilian infrastructure. Number one, to generate as many refugees as possible, because refugees don't fight, they run. And the more Ukrainians that you can get out of the cities and out of Ukraine, the better. So we've had 2.5 million Ukrainian refugees so far. It is the single largest refugee flow ever, and it's happened in less than 3 weeks. You should count that 2.5 million going up at least to 10 over the course of the next couple of months, probably higher. The reason that the Russians are doing this civilian obliteration program is because if you have moved most of the population out, then when you do move in with troops, it's just shoot on sight for whatever you see. That's what they did in Grozny. That is what they did in Aleppo. And they will do this for every single population center that they come across. They're also doing it for every small city and town. Now, a couple things come from this. Number one, it means that the would-be guerrillas have very few places to hide, and the Russians can just assume that anyone who is still there is hostile. So it removes all the decision-making from the military. Second, if you obliterate the cities and towns, the farmers can't plant or harvest. So you generate a famine at the same time. And from the Russian point of view, the more dislocated, the more starving the population is, the less resistance they can generate. And this is what they're going to do for the entire country. That's already what they're doing for places like Mariupol and Mykolaiv and Kiev and Kharkiv. But it's going to be done everywhere. About 250,000 for active. Reserves is going to be closer to 10 million. Remember, this is a country that has a draft. So basically anyone under age 45 could be added to that reserve list if they feel it's necessary.
So a lot of the population is
I see what you're talking
trained.
about. That's going to be closer to 1 million.
Okay.
And remember, that is not counting their internal security forces, which are going to be another couple of million. So the Russian strategy going back to the early czars has been to expand until you hit those gateways. That means they've conquered a lot of people along the way. So the army goes in, gets rid of the regular resistance, and then the Interior Ministry forces go in and establish an information collection system and basically rule by terror. So once the conventional resistance in Ukraine is pacified, that's when the Interior Ministry troops will come in, and that's when things get really ugly. That's when you get your pogrom. In the American experience, we've had gateway territories as well. Back before we and the Canadians kind of made up, the two big gateways were the Windsor-Detroit connection, the narrow point where the Great Lakes come together, and Lake Champlain, which provided maritime access across the border. And so you could use amphibious landings that go fairly deep into both territories. And so all of the treaties that we had with the Brits when Canada was still a British protectorate dealt with those two zones specifically. They were kind of our hot points, our own gateways going north-south. Now, that was obviously fixed before the Civil War, so we haven't had to think about that. A more recent example would be, say, if you remember back to your Cold War history, you remember the Fulda Gap. It was a place in Germany where there was an opening in the Black Forest Mountains, and that is where we were always obsessed about the Russians coming through in mass, and so that was where we stationed a lot of tactical nukes for a worst-case scenario. The Russians have 9 of these, and they've always, every time they've been invaded, it's been through one of the 9. And I realize that in a world of hypersonic missiles, we don't think about this as much, but as we learned in Iraq, and as we learned in places like Lebanon, and as the Russians have learned in places like Grozny, if you can't secure the land, the rest of it just doesn't matter. Air power is all great and everything, but it doesn't hold territory. And air power by itself is not going to stop an army. Now, is there anyone that looks like they're going to invade Russia now? Of course not. But that's not the point. From the Russian point of view, if they don't do this now, they will not have the demographic strength to resist a future invasion. And something that has happened in the last 3 weeks that I've got to admit has got me a little freaked out. Students of history, especially military history, always look to the example of the Nazi rise in 1936 and how from 1936 to 1939, 3 years, the Germans went from a destitute, depression-riddled Weimar Republic to the Nazi war machine. The capacity of a modern industrialized country, especially the modern industrialized countries that Russia is concerned about, to reinvent themselves overnight is huge. And on the 3rd day of the Ukraine war, Chancellor Scholz, who is a pacifist and a socialist, announced that within 2 years the Germans were going to double their defense spending. And, that's great for the point of containing Russia, but as a student of history, I had to take a step back there for a second because it felt really familiar and not at all comfortable. Let's hope that Germany's democracy survives this.